So this is Dorian Warren, co-president of Community Change, here with Chirag Mehta, Policy and Ideas Director at Community Change. And Chirag, thanks for joining to have a conversation about Black workers and the Federal Reserve. So before we go to the crisis, talk to us about what is the vision for what we want. What are we trying to get to? And then we'll break down the problems in terms of the crisis among Black workers and what the Federal Reserve has to do with it. So what are we aiming for here?
We need to make sure that we get to full employment for Black workers. And that means that every Black worker who wants a good job can find a good job, a job with dignity that provides, a wage and benefits that you can support a family on. There's a few other metrics, but that's our definition of what full employment really means. And so getting to full employment is the immediate goal, and it's certainly achievable. There's no reason why we can't get to full employment for Black workers in this country. It's really a choice. We have to choose to do that. Policymakers have to choose to do that. The second goal really is to, by way of that, we have to dismantle the ways that our economic policy systemically is biased against Black workers. So when I say we have a choice, one, we have to choose that this is an actual crisis. It's a perpetual one. We need to solve it. And two, we have to solve it by making sure that our economic policy doesn't have the kind of systemic biases that it does now that disadvantages Black workers.
So let's go there for a minute in terms of the longstanding crisis among Black workers. So from the data I've seen, roughly since the 1970s, the Black unemployment rate has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate. And then we get to the Great Recession in 07, 08, 09. And I think it's clear, maybe you could say more about this, that Black workers didn't recover nearly as fast as white workers. So that the long decade of the 2010s has been one where Black workers have struggled to find jobs and work. And when they do, as you pointed out, Black workers tend to be concentrated in low wage jobs with unpredictable scheduling, not full-time work, et cetera. And then that's all happening, that long crisis, if we go back to the 70s, with the pit stop at the Great Recession, which is very damaging for Black communities and Black workers. And then we get to the pandemic. And talk to us about what happened to Black workers over the last 2-3 years in terms of the public health crisis and the economic crisis.
Sure. I think what you're pointing out, this sort of arc from the 70s, is really when we began to actually track unemployment by race. And so I think that the sort of Black-white unemployment gap that you're pointing out here probably did exist before that. But really, we had a clear picture of how the Black-white unemployment gap changes over time across business cycles since the 70s. Mm-hmm. And yes, it is largely 2 to 1. And what sort of happens in these different cycles, it happened during the Great Recession, and it certainly happened during the pandemic, is, as the economy slows down, typically, Black workers will be the first ones that will experience mass unemployment. They're the first
last hired, first fired.
First, yeah, in this case, when a recession starts, they're the first ones to be let go. And then, as the economy begins to recover, employers begin to rehire workers. White workers are the first ones back in. Black workers are the last ones to be hired. And then, what ends up happening is, there's some of this is just sort of, what happens. There's a, business cycle, and employers their employment ebbs and flows over time. There are recessions, there are recoveries. But truly, before, economy can really recover to a point where Black workers are rehired, employers are actually hiring Black workers at scale back onto the jobs, the economy will slow down again. And Black workers never really get to a point where they're getting to full employment, because employers are hiring, essentially white workers and other workers first. What happened during the pandemic, it's a little different, but the same pattern has essentially emerged here as the economy has recovered. In the beginning, everyone, essentially we had a shutdown. It was not a typical recession. This was not a demand-led, as they call it, demand-led recession, where people just stopped spending money, employers stopped investing, and that was the cause of the recession. That was not the cause. The cause was
that was what happened in 07, 08.
Absolutely, it was a demand. A financial crisis and that triggered a demand-led recession where people just basically stopped spending money. In this case, we shut down the economy.
Mm,
as essentially as a public health, a way to protect the public health. In this case, white workers were being laid off, not nearly as the same rate as black workers, and I'll get to the reason why in a second. But you saw the black-white unemployment gap actually shrink to some of the lowest levels
mm,
we've ever seen. But
mm,
not because black workers were achieving more employment. Of course, it's because white workers were suffering at a level that was comparable, relatively speaking, to black
mm,
workers.
mm,
But here, as we reopen the economy, employers are starting to hire workers back. You see the black-white unemployment gap go back to the levels that we typically see, about 2 to 1. And what's encouraging now is that black workers the unemployment rate is around 5.8% for black women, 7.1% for black men. I mean, that in and of itself isn't encouraging. What is
mhm,
encouraging is that the rate is actually falling, that employers are
mm,
actually hiring black workers. And so we are at a very pivotal point in our economy, especially considering all of the concern about inflation. Like,
mhm.
we have a choice right now to continue to encourage employers to hire black workers, or to slow the economy down to deal with inflation. And my concern here is that we're going to slow the economy down to deal with the inflation crisis. That ultimately, if we do slow the economy down, we'll make black workers pay the price for inflation that is not their fault.